What if the person you're complaining to is the one who actually owns the place? One night, a waitress thought she was venting to a coworker about her unfair boss. But in the corner of the diner, an unexpected customer was listening. The CEO himself. And what he did next, no one saw coming. Mark Hamilton stepped out of his black sedan and took a moment to glance up at the warm glow of the restaurant's sign. Hamilton's Prime Steakhouse, one of the many high-end restaurants under his corporate empire. It was an establishment known for its impeccable service, carefully curated menus, and an atmosphere that exuded understated luxury. Yet, despite being the CEO, Mark hadn't set foot in this particular location in years. Lately, he had been feeling detached from the reality of the business he had built. Board meetings, spreadsheets, and investor calls had replaced the hands-on approach he once prided himself on. Tonight, he wanted to see firsthand how things were running, without the filter of reports or carefully rehearsed presentations. No entourage, no formal visits, just a man having dinner at his own restaurant, observing the machine in motion. He stepped inside, the familiar scent of seared meat and aged wine filling the air. The restaurant was buzzing with activity, waiters weaving between tables, the hum of conversation blending with the soft clinking of glasses. Couples leaned in over candlelit dinners. A group of businessmen clinked whiskey tumblers in a toast, and a young family shared a quiet moment in a booth near the back. Mark chose a seat in a secluded corner, away from the main flow of foot traffic. From here, he could take everything in unnoticed. A waiter promptly handed him a menu, but he barely glanced at it, instead letting his eyes wander around the room. The service appeared seamless, but he knew better than to judge a place by its surface. Then, something caught his attention. A young waitress, Emily, was moving between tables with practiced efficiency. But there was a tightness to her movements, a subtle exhaustion in her posture. Every few minutes, she stole a glance at the clock on the far wall. Her smile remained, but it was strained, forced. Mark observed as she returned to the service station near the kitchen. Her shoulders slightly hunched. She reached for a water pitcher but froze for a second, inhaling deeply before continuing. Something was weighing on her. Curious, Mark got up under the pretense of checking out the wine display near the kitchen entrance. As he walked past the swinging doors leading to the back, he heard it, a quiet, choked sob. He paused, glancing around. The restaurant's main floor remained undisturbed. Unaware, slowly, he took a step closer to the doors, careful not to be noticed. "I don't know what else to do," a voice whispered, thick with emotion. It was Emily. "You have to say something." Another voice urged, a coworker. "Perhaps." "I can't," Emily responded, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said if I complain, he'll cut my shifts. I already lost 2 this month. Rent's due. I can't afford to." Her voice broke off into another quiet sob. Mark's jaw tightened. "David doesn't care," Emily continued. "He keeps making us stay past closing. But the hours never show up on payroll. It's like we never worked them. And if we argue, he just finds a reason to get rid of us." Mark didn't need to hear more. David Carter, the restaurant's general manager. Mark recognized the name from financial reports. On paper, David had improved efficiency, cut down unnecessary expenses, and increased profitability. But if what Emily said was true, those efficiencies came at the cost of his employees. Mark took a slow breath. He had come here tonight expecting to enjoy a quiet meal, maybe make a few notes on service quality. Instead, he had stumbled upon something far more troubling. He had a choice. He could sit back, finish his dinner, and let things be. That would be the easy option. After all, he had no shortage of executives beneath him whose job was to handle these matters. But Mark wasn't the kind of man who ignored problems once he saw them. His appetite was gone. Instead, a new thought took its place. If this was happening here, in one of his own restaurants, how deep did this problem go? Mark remained in his seat, his dinner barely touched. His mind was elsewhere, piecing together the conversation he had overheard. He needed more than just whispers before taking any action. If this was a systemic problem, he had to see it firsthand. His eyes shifted toward the kitchen doors, where David Carter emerged. The restaurant's general manager carried himself with an air of authority, his crisp white dress shirt neatly tucked into his dark slacks. At a glance, he looked like any other seasoned manager running a successful establishment. But Mark had dealt with enough men in power to recognize a different kind of authority, the kind that came not from respect, but from fear. David moved through the dining area with calculated precision, scanning the room like a man who expected compliance. When a young waiter hesitated at the service station, fumbling with a tray of drinks, David's hand landed on his shoulder. It was a light touch, but the way the waiter stiffened spoke volumes. David leaned in, whispered something, and within seconds, the waiter straightened up, moving faster. Minutes later, a busboy approached David hesitantly, rubbing the back of his neck. Mark watched as the young man muttered something, shifting uncomfortably. David's expression didn't change, but his body language did. He took a single step forward, his voice low but sharp. The busboy swallowed hard and nodded before retreating back to work. Then, Emily approached him. From Mark's vantage point, he could see her posture, rigid, hands clenched together in front of her apron. She spoke quietly, eyes downcast. David barely let her finish before shaking his head. Mark didn't need to hear the words to know what was happening. She was asking to leave early. David's response was immediate. He gestured toward the floor, then to his watch. Whatever he said made Emily's shoulders sag in defeat. She gave a quick nod before hurrying back to the floor. Mark exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about Emily. David was exerting control over all of them. Mark knew he couldn't act yet. If he confronted David now, it would tip him off. He needed to understand the full scope of what was happening. When Emily came by his table to refill his water, Mark decided to take his first step. That looked intense, he said casually, nodding toward where she had been speaking with David. Emily froze for half a second before forcing a polite smile. Just part of the job. Mark returned the smile but didn't let it drop. You sure? She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the pitcher's handle. Is there anything else I can get you? Mark lowered his voice. Emily, I own this restaurant. Her breath hitched, and she nearly dropped the pitcher. What? Not just this one. The whole chain, he clarified. I came in tonight as a customer because I wanted to see things for myself. Emily's eyes darted around, making sure no one else was listening. I don't think I can talk about this. I get it, Mark said, keeping his voice steady. But if something is wrong here, I need to know. She looked at him, conflict evident on her face. For a moment, it seemed like she might walk away. Then, in a near whisper, she spoke. It's been happening for months. She admitted. Not just me, a lot of us. Mark leaned in slightly. Tell me everything. She took a shaky breath. David makes us stay late. Sometimes hours past closing, but it never shows up on our paychecks. If we ask about it, we're told we're lucky to have jobs at all. If anyone pushes back, their hours start disappearing. Mark's jaw clenched. And no one's reported it? Emily let out a hollow laugh. To who? He's the one in charge here. That answer didn't sit right with him. What about payroll? HR? Emily glanced toward the back of the restaurant, her expression darkening. The accounting team? They won't talk. Either they're scared, or they're in on it. Mark considered this. If the financial department was complicit, that meant this issue went beyond just one bad manager. He needed proof. Finishing his water, he stood. I need to check something. Emily's eyes widened. Wait, what are you going to? Nothing drastic, he assured her. Just a look at the numbers. Moving with purpose, he approached the service counter, where a young woman in business attire was sorting through paperwork. She looked up when he approached, her hands freezing over a stack of invoices. I'd like to speak with whoever handles payroll here, Mark said smoothly. The woman blinked. That would be Henry. But then I'd like to speak with Henry. She hesitated, glancing toward the back office. A moment later, a man emerged. A middle-aged accountant with thinning hair and glasses perched at the edge of his nose. He adjusted them as he approached. Can I help you? Mark extended a hand. Mark Hamilton, CEO. Henry stiffened. I wasn't expecting. Mark cut him off with a polite but firm smile. I need to see the payroll records. Henry swallowed hard. I don't have access to those files right now. Mark arched an eyebrow. A payroll officer who doesn't have access to payroll? Henry's face paled slightly. I mean, they're not here in the office. They're processed at corporate. Mark didn't believe him for a second. You don't keep any records on site? Henry fidgeted. Only summaries. Nothing detailed. Mark studied him. The man was nervous, too nervous. He knew something. Fine, Mark said easily. Show me the summaries. Henry hesitated before reluctantly retrieving a binder from the cabinet behind him. He opened it, flipping through pages before handing it over. Mark scanned the numbers. At first glance, everything appeared legitimate, but as he looked closer, he noticed discrepancies. Some employees had irregular deductions, amounts that didn't match standard tax withholdings. Others showed no overtime logged, despite the restaurant being open late on multiple occasions. And then there was the biggest red flag of all. A series of adjustments marked as miscellaneous deductions. Vague, untraceable, and yet, when totaled, they amounted to thousands of dollars. Mark closed the binder. He had seen enough. This wasn't just a local issue. This was systemic. And now, he had proof. Mark sat in his office, staring at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The distant hum of traffic below was drowned out by the thoughts racing through his mind. He had come to the restaurant expecting to see how things were running. Maybe catch a few minor inefficiencies. Instead, he had uncovered something far worse. There was no denying it now. David Carter was manipulating the payroll, exploiting his employees, and intimidating them into silence. But Mark knew this couldn't just be one rogue manager skimming a few extra dollars. The numbers he had seen suggested something bigger, something systematic. He turned back to his desk, pressing a button on his keyboard. The screen in front of him flickered to life, displaying the secure internal database of Hamilton Prime Holdings. His executive clearance gave him access to nearly everything: profit margins, vendor contracts, employee records. But tonight, there was only one thing he cared about: payroll. With a few keystrokes, he pulled up the financial records for the restaurant he had visited. At first glance, everything looked standard. Salaries matched positions. Tax withholdings were consistent. But then he noticed it: the same category of deductions he had seen in the physical binder at the restaurant. Miscellaneous deductions. The amounts varied, but the pattern was clear. Some employees were losing small sums, $20, $30 per paycheck. Others had entire overtime hours wiped from their records. And all of that missing money? It wasn't simply disappearing. Mark leaned forward, his fingers tightening on the edge of his desk. The funds were being redirected, filtered into an internal account under a nondescript operational code. It wasn't tied to any particular location, which meant it wasn't just happening at this one restaurant. His stomach tightened. This was bigger than David Carter. Mark reached for his phone and dialed a number from memory. Jason, it's Mark. I need to see you in my office. Now. A pause. Then, Jason Miller's voice came through, slightly hesitant. Mark, it's almost 10. Can this wait until morning? No, Mark said. It can't. 15 minutes later, Jason walked into Mark's office, still adjusting the cuffs of his dress shirt. He was in his early 50s, sharp-dressed, with the careful composure of someone who had spent years navigating corporate politics. What's going on? Jason asked, lowering himself into the chair across from Mark's desk. Mark didn't waste time. He turned the screen toward Jason. Payroll discrepancies. Have you seen this before? Jason frowned as he scanned the screen. Where did you pull this from? Mark ignored the question. Some employees are losing wages under fabricated deductions. The money isn't vanishing. It's being funneled into an internal account. Who authorized this? Jason exhaled through his nose. Leaning back, Mark, he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I've seen similar transactions before, but I was told it was part of an operational cost adjustment. Mark narrowed his eyes. By who? Jason shook his head. It was never presented as anything illegal. The numbers always balanced. It wasn't my place to question it. That's not an answer, Mark said coldly. Jason hesitated again. Then, lowering his voice, he said, Look, I flagged something like this a few months ago. When I asked about it, I was told it was a minor correction in the payroll system, nothing outside legal boundaries. And that was it. Mark studied him. Jason wasn't a fool. He knew how to follow money, how to spot a red flag. If he had let this slide, It meant one of two things: either he was protecting someone, or he had been warned to look the other way. Who told you to ignore it? Mark pressed. Jason held his gaze for a long moment before finally shaking his head. Mark, if you push too hard on this, you might not like what you find. Mark let the words hang in the air. He didn't flinch. Finally, Jason sighed. I'll have my team pull a full report on payroll for all locations. But, Mark, if this is really what you think it is, you need to be careful. Mark nodded but said nothing. He already knew that much. As Jason left the office, Mark turned back to the screen, his mind already racing ahead. This wasn't just an isolated case, and if it was happening across multiple locations, then there was someone higher up pulling the strings. He needed more than numbers. He needed proof, and to get it, he'd have to go back into the field himself. Mark arrived at the restaurant just past 10, when the late dinner rush had thinned and the staff had settled into the quiet rhythm of closing duties. The atmosphere felt different at this hour: dimmer lights, hushed voices, the scent of coffee lingering in the air as servers wiped down tables and stacked chairs. Without the ever-watchful presence of David Carter, the employees seemed more at ease. He scanned the room, looking for a familiar face. Emily was at the far end of the dining area, gathering silverware into a tray. When she noticed him, her eyes flickered with recognition. But she didn't approach. Smart move. A sudden conversation with the CEO might draw attention. Instead, Mark made his way to the back, toward the small break room adjacent to the kitchen. He had arranged to meet someone there, a former employee who knew exactly what David was doing. Inside, a woman sat alone at the scratched wooden table, fingers tapping lightly against a disposable coffee cup. She looked up as he entered. Sarah Collins? Mark asked, shutting the door behind him. She nodded, studying him carefully. I didn't think you'd actually come. Sarah was younger than he expected, maybe late 20s, with sharp brown eyes that held a quiet intensity. Her uniform was different from the rest, black polo instead of white, embroidered with the name of a different Hamilton's prime location. I appreciate you meeting me, he said. She let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. Not a lot of people care what happens to restaurant workers, especially not executives. Mark pulled out a chair and sat across from her. I do. Sarah held his gaze for a moment before nodding. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small black USB drive, placing it on the table between them. Before David fired me, I made copies of everything I could get my hands on, she said. Payroll records, internal emails, stuff they thought no one would notice. Mark picked up the drive, turning it between his fingers. Why did he fire you? Sarah exhaled, leaning back. I started asking questions. Some of the kitchen staff were getting their wages cut for violating company policy, but no one could explain what those violations were. Then I noticed my own paychecks were lighter than they should have been. Her expression darkened. I went to HR, thinking it was a mistake. 2 weeks later, David told me my performance wasn't up to standard. I'd been here for 5 years. Mark felt a slow burn in his chest. This wasn't just about financial fraud, it was about power. David didn't just steal wages. He silenced people. He plugged the USB into his laptop and opened the files. It didn't take long before he found something damning. An email chain between David Carter and Richard Thompson, the company's vice president of operations. David had been reporting directly to Richard about his labor cost efficiency strategies. The messages made it clear Richard knew about the wage theft. Worse, he approved of it. Mark clenched his jaw as he scrolled through the conversation. David, we've managed to cut overtime payouts by 14% this quarter. Employees are adjusting to the scheduling changes. Richard, good. The board will be pleased with the numbers. Keep it discreet. No paper trails beyond internal logs. David, understood. A few employees have started asking questions. Richard, then they're not the right fit for our company. Mark inhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. He had expected something bad. But this was deliberate. Calculated. A system designed to bleed workers dry while protecting the people at the top. Do you see it now? Sarah asked. David isn't the real problem. He's just the guy making it happen. But Richard? He's the one making sure no one stops it. Mark nodded, closing the laptop. This is enough to blow the whole thing open." A slow clap echoed from the doorway. Mark's muscles tensed as he turned. David Carter leaned against the frame, arms crossed, wearing a smirk that sent a chill down Mark's spine. "Mr. Hamilton," David said, his tone almost amused, "I have to admit, I didn't expect the CEO himself to go snooping around in employee break rooms." Quite the personal touch. Sarah stiffened beside him, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Mark shut his laptop calmly, masking his irritation. "Just doing my job, David. Something tells me you've been doing a little extra outside yours." David chuckled, stepping further inside. "Come on, Mark. You're a businessman. You know how this works. Costs need to be controlled. And let's be honest, the board only cares about numbers, not how we hit them." Mark studied him carefully. There was no panic, no scrambling to cover up what he'd just seen. Which meant David knew something Mark didn't. Mark stood, sliding the USB back into his pocket. "Stealing from your employees isn't cost control, David. It's fraud. And I have proof." David's smirk deepened. "Do you?" Before Mark could respond, David pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. A moment later, a new voice filled the room. "Mr. Carter, we have a situation. Security reports an unauthorized data transfer from our internal servers." Mark's stomach dropped. Someone had tipped them off. David lowered the phone and grinned. "I believe that would be your little attempt at playing detective, Mark. And I hate to say it, but that's a direct violation of company security protocols." Sarah turned to Mark in alarm. "They're trying to flip this on you." David took a slow step forward. "You see, Mark, the beautiful thing about power is that it's all about perception. Right now, you look like the CEO who's digging where you shouldn't. And I look like the guy who just caught you." Mark kept his expression neutral, but his mind was already working through the implications. If Richard and David were ahead of him, that meant they had control of the narrative. And if he didn't act fast, they wouldn't just protect themselves. They'd bury him with it. Mark kept his expression neutral as he studied David Carter. The restaurant manager leaned against the doorframe with the confidence of a man who had already won. His smirk was steady, his posture relaxed. There was no fear in his eyes, only amusement. As if this were nothing more than an inside joke that Mark had been too slow to understand. Inside, Mark's mind raced. Someone had tipped David off. The fact that security had flagged his data access meant that Richard Thompson was already one step ahead. David took a slow step forward, eyes never leaving Mark's. "You know, you're not the first person to start asking questions." Mark tilted his head slightly. "That so?" David's smirk widened. "There have been others. Employees, auditors, even a couple of junior execs who got a little too curious. Funny thing is, none of them lasted long. One way or another, they either lost interest or lost their jobs." Sarah stiffened beside Mark, but he remained still, forcing himself to appear unbothered. He had dealt with men like David before. Bullies who thrived on fear, who assumed silence was inevitable. "You've been busy," Mark said, his voice even, "skimming wages, keeping people in line, but I'm guessing you don't act alone." David chuckled. "Of course not. That would be reckless." He spread his arms in a mock gesture of honesty. "I just follow orders, Mark. That's how things work. The higher-ups decide what needs to be done, and I make sure it happens. Simple as that." Mark nodded slowly, as if considering his words. "And you're okay with that?" David shrugged. "I don't ask questions I don't want the answers to." Mark exhaled, then reached into his pocket. David tensed for half a second, just enough to confirm he wasn't as untouchable as he pretended to be. But all Mark pulled out was his phone. "Sarah, I need you to go," Mark said without looking at her. She hesitated. "But, now," he said firmly. David watched her go without interference, which meant he wasn't worried about her. He was only concerned with Mark. When the door clicked shut, Mark met David's gaze again. "Tell Richard the first got the message." David grinned. "Good man. I knew you'd see reason." Mark pocketed his phone, giving nothing away. "But you can also tell him I don't scare easily." David's smirk faltered just slightly. Mark didn't wait for a response. He walked past him, out of the break room, through the restaurant, and into the night. Inside the car, Mark let out a slow breath. He had known this wouldn't be easy. But now it was clear, David and Richard weren't just covering their tracks. They were setting traps. As he reached into his pocket, his fingers froze. The USB was gone. Mark's pulse quickened as he searched his pockets again. But it was no use. It had been there before the meeting. Someone had taken it. His thoughts immediately went to the security alert. If Richard had been monitoring the internal system, then he had known exactly what Mark was looking for. And if he had known that, he had probably anticipated the USB's existence. Mark started the car, heading straight for his office. By the time he arrived, the feeling of unease had settled into something heavier. His assistant was gone for the night, but the motion sensor lights flickered on as he entered. He walked straight to his desk, unlocking his computer. He barely had to look to confirm what he already knew. The emails were gone. The payroll discrepancies, the flagged deductions, the communications between David and Richard, everything had been wiped. The files hadn't just been deleted. They had been overwritten, buried beneath layers of system updates. Mark leaned back, staring at the screen. Someone on the inside had done this. And that meant they had access at a level that only a handful of executives did. His phone buzzed. Jason Miller. Mark answered without hesitation. Tell me you have good news. There was a long pause. Then Jason sighed. Not exactly. I just got off a call with the board. Mark sat up. And? Jason hesitated. There's been a complaint filed against you. Mark. Several. Actually. Mark closed his eyes briefly. Let me guess. Employee harassment? Abuse of power? Jason exhaled. They're saying you've been using your position to intimidate staff. That you've been conducting unauthorized investigations into company operations. Mark's grip tightened on the phone. And the board is buying this? Jason's voice dropped slightly. Richard controls half of them. Mark, you know that. And with no evidence left on the servers. Mark ran a hand over his jaw. It was a clean move. Richard hadn't just erased the proof, he had turned Mark into the problem. Where does this leave me? Mark asked. Jason hesitated again. The board is calling an emergency meeting. You need to be ready. Mark nodded to himself. Richard wants me out. Jason didn't respond, which was answer enough. Mark hung up and set the phone down. Richard hadn't just covered his tracks. He had forced Mark into a corner. If Mark pushed forward, they would use the allegations to remove him. If he backed off, they would win by default. Mark exhaled slowly. If Richard and David thought this was over, they were wrong. They wanted a fight? They were about to get one. Mark sat in the dim glow of his office, fingers tapping restlessly against the edge of his desk. The walls around him felt tighter than usual, as if the entire corporate structure he had built was now pressing down on him. His access to the internal system was compromised. The board was breathing down his neck, and Richard Thompson had made it clear that he wasn't just playing defense, he was on the attack. Mark needed to change the game. He reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found a familiar name. Michael Carter, a journalist with a reputation for taking down corporate fraudsters. Michael had spent years exposing corruption, often making powerful enemies in the process. He had tried to go after Richard once before but never got far. The story had gone cold. Mark dialed the number. It rang twice before a tired voice answered. Didn't expect to hear from you. Hamilton, Michael said. The last time we spoke, you told me to stay the hell away from your company. Mark sighed. That was before I realized just how deep this mess goes. There was a pause. Then Michael's tone shifted, curiosity edging into his voice. I'm listening. Mark wasted no time. Richard Thompson. Payroll fraud. Money being siphoned from employee wages and funneled into an internal slush fund. Michael let out a low whistle. And you have proof? I did, Mark admitted. But Richard erased everything. Every file. Every email. He's got someone inside the system covering his tracks. Michael exhaled. Sounds like you're in trouble. Mark leaned forward. Not if I can prove this another way. If we pull external financial records, tax filings, and compare them with employee-reported wages, we might be able to track where the money is going. There was a brief silence before Michael spoke again. You really want to do this? Mark didn't hesitate. I don't have a choice. Michael chuckled. Good answer. Within the hour, Mark and Michael were sitting across from each other in a quiet cafe. A laptop opened between them. Michael had already started pulling data from publicly available financial reports. "We're looking for discrepancies," Mark explained. "Anything that doesn't match." Michael's fingers flew across the keyboard as he sifted through spreadsheets, corporate filings, and vendor payments. Mark assisted where he could, matching data points against the numbers he had memorized from the deleted files. Then, they found it. Michael pointed at the screen. "Here, see this?" Mark squinted. A large sum of money had been categorized under operational expenses. At first glance, it looked routine, until Michael expanded the details. "Multiple transfers," Michael said, consistently just under the threshold that would require additional reporting. Mark's jaw tightened. "And where's it going?" Michael followed the digital trail, tracing the money through various holding accounts until it landed on a name that made Mark's blood run cold. A company under Richard Thompson's direct control. "Bingo," Michael muttered. "This isn't just wage theft. He's laundering it." Mark leaned back, exhaling slowly. This was what he needed. Solid proof that Richard wasn't just protecting David Carter. He was personally profiting from the stolen wages. But before Mark could say anything, his phone buzzed with an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Hamilton." A distorted voice came through the line. "Stop now." Mark stiffened. "Who is this?" The voice remained calm, almost indifferent. "You're making a mistake." Mark's grip tightened on the phone. "That depends on your perspective." A brief pause. Then the voice said, "I don't want you to end up like the last one." A chill crawled up Mark's spine. "The last one?" A notification appeared on his screen, a text message with an attachment. Mark opened it. It was a picture of Sarah Collins. She was walking alone, unaware, her face half turned away. Mark's heart pounded. The voice on the line spoke one last time. "Turn back, Hamilton, before it's too late." The call disconnected. Mark looked at Michael, his expression grim. "They're not just coming for me," he said. "They're coming for everyone involved." Michael closed his laptop. "Then we need to hit first." Mark nodded, his jaw set. This wasn't just about exposing Richard anymore. It was about survival. Mark's fingers tightened around his phone as he listened to the ringing. Sarah wasn't answering. He tried again, waiting for the familiar sound of her voicemail. Nothing. A cold sense of urgency settled in his gut. He switched over to Michael Carter's number. The journalist picked up on the second ring. "She's gone," Michael said, his voice tense. Mark's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you mean, gone?" Michael sighed. "She was supposed to meet with a labor attorney last night, but she never showed. Her landlord says her apartment's been empty since yesterday. And she's not the only one. I tried reaching out to another former employee who was working with her on gathering evidence, same thing. No response. It's like they disappeared." Mark pushed back his chair and stood, pacing toward the window. "Someone took her." Michael was quiet for a moment. "Or scared her into running." Mark shook his head. "No, she wouldn't just disappear. Not after everything." He needed to move fast. Turning back to his desk, he accessed the company's internal system. He still had enough authority to pull up employee schedules and check in records. Sarah hadn't worked at the restaurant in months, but she had booked a meeting yesterday under a corporate system login. The location was outside of company headquarters, an unusual choice for an employee with no current role. Mark frowned. The meeting was scheduled at a legal office, but Sarah never checked in. Instead, her last known location was flagged near a storage warehouse on the outskirts of the city. He ran a search on the property records. The building was owned by a subsidiary, one of the smaller shell companies under Richard Thompson's control. His pulse quickened. He switched back to the call. "I know where she is." Michael hesitated. "Do I even want to ask how you found out?" "Not right now," Mark said. "Meet me at the location. Bring whatever you can in case this goes sideways." Michael exhaled sharply. "I don't like this, Mark. If they've got her, they're not just sending a warning. They're making a statement." "I know," Mark said. "That's why we have to get her out." He grabbed his keys and headed for the door. The drive to the warehouse was tense. The roads were mostly empty at this hour, the city lights fading behind him as he moved toward the industrial outskirts. The building itself sat in the middle of a deserted lot, fenced off with a chain-link barrier. A few dim security lights cast weak halos over the cracked pavement. Michael's car was already parked a short distance away. Mark pulled in next to him and stepped out. Michael nodded toward the building. I checked. No security cameras outside, but that doesn't mean no one's watching. Mark scanned the area. Sarah's car was parked near one of the side entrances, but there was no sign of movement inside. We need to move fast, Mark said. Michael pulled out his phone. I've got a contact at the local precinct. I can send a tip, but we won't have much time before someone realizes what's happening. Mark hesitated for only a second before nodding. Do it, then we go in. Michael stepped away to make the call while Mark approached the building. The door was locked, but the latch was old. With a firm push, it gave way. The inside was dark and smelled of dust and motor oil. Mark motioned for Michael to follow, and they moved quietly down the corridor. Faint sounds echoed through the space, muffled voices coming from a room deeper inside. They turned a corner and found a small storage room. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, Sarah sat on a chair, her hands tied in front of her. Her face was pale, but she wasn't hurt. Mark stepped inside quickly, loosening the rope. Are you okay? Sarah's eyes widened in relief. You shouldn't be here. Michael stood by the door, keeping watch. We need to move, now. Before they could leave, a voice came from the shadows. I was hoping you'd come. A man stepped forward, flanked by two others. He was older, dressed in a dark suit, his expression unreadable. Mark recognized him immediately, one of Richard Thompson's top enforcers. You've made a mistake, Hamilton, the man said, his tone almost casual. This isn't about some restaurant payroll scheme anymore. Mark's jaw tightened. Then what is it about? The man smiled. Power, and the fact that you don't have enough of it to win. Mark took a slow step forward. Let her go. The man chuckled. Or what? Michael's phone buzzed once. He glanced at it and smirked. The sound of sirens filled the air outside. The man's expression darkened. He turned to his men. We're leaving. Mark didn't move as they disappeared through a side exit, their footsteps fading into the night. A few moments later, flashing lights illuminated the warehouse. Michael patted Mark's shoulder. Looks like we're not the only ones who wanted answers. Mark exhaled. This isn't over. Michael nodded. No, it's not. Sarah looked between them, her voice steady. Then let's finish it. Sarah sat on the edge of the worn-out couch in Michael Carter's office. Her hands clasped tightly together, though she was physically safe. The fear in her eyes hadn't faded. She kept glancing at the door, as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. Mark stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. He knew that look. It was the look of someone who had been pushed too far, who had seen what happened to people who stepped out of line. I can't do this, Sarah finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. They came after me once. If I go public, what's stopping them from trying again? Mark turned to face her. If we don't act now, they win. This doesn't stop with you. How many more people do you think they've done this to? How many more will they go after? She shook her head, gripping the fabric of her jeans. I didn't sign up to be a hero. Mark exhaled, forcing himself to be patient. I get it. You didn't ask for any of this. But you already took the first step when you saved those files. That means something. Sarah looked up at him, doubt still lingering in her expression. Even if I speak out, what if it's not enough? Michael leaned against his desk, arms crossed. It'll be more than enough. Once this goes public, Richard and David won't be able to bury it. We take this to the press. We control the story, not them. Sarah hesitated for another moment before nodding. Okay, let's do it. Michael picked up his phone and dialed a number. I've got a contact who runs an independent news site. She doesn't answer to corporate sponsors, which means she won't be scared off. Mark watched as Michael spoke in hushed tones, setting up a location for the interview. He could feel the weight of what was about to happen. Once this information was out, there would be no going back. The next evening, Sarah sat across from a journalist in a small, dimly lit room. A camera recorded as she laid out everything: how employees had their wages stolen, how David Carter manipulated payroll records, how Richard Thompson knowingly approved the entire scheme. When the interview was published, it spread faster than Mark had anticipated. Within hours, news outlets picked up the story. Social media exploded with outrage. Former employees started coming forward, sharing similar experiences. The company's name was dragged through the mud. By morning, the board of directors had no choice but to act. A statement was released, announcing an internal investigation. Richard Thompson and David Carter were officially summoned to address the accusations. Investors demanded answers. Stockholders panicked. For the first time, Mark felt like they had the upper hand. But then Richard made his move. At a hastily arranged press conference, Richard stood before the cameras. His expression calm, his voice measured. He acknowledged the allegations, confirmed the internal investigation, then dropped the bombshell. "This is a difficult situation," he said, looking directly into the cameras. "But the truth is, these cost-cutting measures were implemented under the direct leadership of our CEO, Mark Hamilton." A murmur spread through the press. Reporters exchanged quick glances. Richard continued, "Every financial decision made in this company stems from executive directives. I was simply following the strategic initiatives outlined by Mark Hamilton himself. If there were discrepancies, it is only because we were operating within the guidelines set by our leadership." Mark stared at the screen in disbelief. Richard wasn't just defending himself. He was turning the entire scandal against Mark. Within an hour, Mark received an official notice from the board. His position as CEO was suspended pending further investigation. He had gone from exposing the truth to being framed as the mastermind behind the entire scheme. Richard had flipped the game. Mark sat in the back of a dimly lit bar, his phone vibrating constantly with missed calls and unread messages. The television above the counter played a news segment discussing his suspension. The accusations against him now the top headline across every major network. The words, corporate fraud, internal corruption, and executive misconduct, flashed across the screen, each one hammering deeper into his chest. Richard had moved fast, faster than Mark had anticipated. With Mark out of the way, Richard wasted no time in consolidating power. Within hours of the board's emergency meeting, he had been named interim CEO, stepping into the role with the kind of smooth assurance that came with a carefully crafted plan. Worse, the board was starting to believe him. A series of forged documents had surfaced, signatures, emails, and internal memos, all pointing to Mark as the one who had signed off on the wage cuts and manipulated financial records. Mark clenched his jaw. He knew those documents were fake, but proving that to the board would be nearly impossible without solid evidence. And right now, Richard controlled all access to the company's internal systems. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Sarah and Michael, both slipping into the booth across from him. Sarah looked exhausted, her face pale under the neon glow of the bar's sign. Michael had the look of a man who had seen this game played before, except this time. It was personal. Michael set a laptop on the table. "We found something." Mark leaned in, his pulse quickening. "Tell me." Sarah tapped a few keys, pulling up a series of financial transfers. "Richard's been careful, but not careful enough. There's a private bank account, one not listed on any official records. The money funneled from employee wages? It doesn't just disappear, it lands here." Mark studied the screen, following the flow of numbers. The account was registered under a shell company, one of many Richard had quietly created. But this wasn't just about wage theft. Michael exhaled sharply. "This isn't just a slush fund. He's laundering it." Mark nodded. "He's cleaning the money through third-party transactions, disguising it as operating costs." Sarah looked up, concern in her eyes. "The problem is, this proof isn't enough. We can see the transactions, but unless we can tie it directly to Richard, it won't hold up." Mark leaned back, running a hand over his jaw. "The final piece of evidence is inside the company's internal servers." Michael crossed his arms. "And you don't have access anymore." Mark was silent for a moment before his phone buzzed. He glanced at the message, then looked up. "I might have another way." A few hours later, Mark was in the parking garage of a high-rise building, waiting. The air was thick with the scent of oil and concrete, the distant hum of the city barely reaching the underground level. Then, footsteps. A young man emerged from the shadows, glancing around nervously. He wore a hooded sweatshirt, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Are you Mark Hamilton?" the man asked. Mark studied him carefully. "Who are you?" The man shifted on his feet. You don't know me, but I know Richard Thompson. He hesitated. I used to work in the IT department at corporate. Until I saw something I wasn't supposed to. Mark's stomach tightened. And what exactly did you see? The man swallowed. I know where the final proof is. The emails. The transaction logs. Everything tying Richard to the fraud. It's all still in the system. Mark narrowed his eyes. If that's true, why hasn't Richard erased it? The man exhaled. Because he thinks no one can reach it. The files are locked behind a restricted firewall. Only a handful of people have clearance. But I know how to get around it. Mark studied him. Why are you helping me? The man's expression hardened. Because Richard threatened me, told me if I ever spoke about what I found, I'd regret it. He shook his head. I don't want to live looking over my shoulder. If you can take him down, I want in. Mark nodded slowly. Then let's get to work. But just as they turned to leave, the sound of tires screeching echoed through the garage. Several men in suits emerged from two black SUVs. Moving quickly. Security. Run. The IT specialist hissed. Before Mark could react, the men grabbed the IT worker. Yanking him back, one of them pulled out a badge, holding it up for Mark to see. This man is under investigation for attempted cyber intrusion. The guard said smoothly. Mark's stomach dropped. This wasn't just about covering tracks. Richard was playing offense. The IT worker struggled. Mark. Don't stop. You need to. A fist slammed into his gut, cutting him off. Mark clenched his fists but forced himself to remain still. If he stepped in now, he'd be next. One of the guards turned to Mark. A smirk on his face. Mr. Hamilton, you might want to get a lawyer. The company is filing charges for attempted corporate sabotage. Mark exhaled slowly. Richard had just raised the stakes. He had lost his access. He had lost his inside man. And now, he was officially a target. But as he walked away, one thought burned in his mind. Richard thought this was over. He was wrong. Mark sat in the corner of his hotel room, staring at the television screen. The news broadcast showed a sleek, well-dressed Richard Thompson standing behind a podium, a carefully measured expression of concern on his face. As part of our commitment to transparency, Richard said, his voice smooth and reassuring, we will be conducting a full internal audit. The unfortunate financial discrepancies that have come to light in recent weeks cannot be ignored. While we are deeply saddened by these developments, it is clear that decisive action must be taken. Mark's stomach tightened as Richard continued. In the coming days, we will be restructuring our leadership team to ensure the integrity of this company. I have already recommended that we move forward without Mr. Mark Hamilton as CEO. The reporters in the audience erupted into questions. Some shouted about the missing wages. Others demanded to know why employees had been intimidated into silence. Richard handled them all with practiced ease, portraying himself as the man cleaning up the mess, the leader who would restore faith in the company. And the worst part? It was working. The camera cut to an image of the board of directors filing into a meeting room, preparing to vote on Richard's permanent appointment as CEO. Mark turned off the television. He had been pushed into a corner. His credibility shattered, his access revoked. If the board voted Richard in, it would cement his control. Any chance of exposing the corruption would vanish. Mark exhaled slowly. There was still one move left. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he never thought he'd call. David Carter answered after 3 rings. I was wondering when you'd call. Hamilton. Mark ignored the smugness in his voice. You know Richard is about to hang you out to dry. David laughed. You think I don't know that? I've been watching the news. Then you know he's already distancing himself from you. He's going to let you take the fall for everything. There was a pause. And what exactly are you offering? Mark leaned forward. I can protect you. David scoffed. You? You don't even have a job anymore. Not officially, Mark admitted, but I still have connections. I can make sure you don't go down alone. But I need something in return. David hesitated. And what would that be? Mark kept his voice steady. The evidence. The real evidence. You were the one carrying out Richard's orders. That means you have records, emails, financial statements, signed approvals. I need them. David let out a long breath. That's a hell of a risk for me. Mark didn't back down. It's the only way you walk away from this. There was a long silence on the line. Then David spoke. Fine, but if I do this, I need something in return. What? Mark asked. David's voice was quiet. I want immunity. No charges. No prison time. Mark considered this. I'll see what I can do. David let out a short laugh. That's not an answer. It's the best you're going to get. Mark said, you know what Richard is capable of. If you wait too long, there won't be anything left to negotiate. Another pause. Then David sighed. I'll text you the location. Meet me there in 2 hours. Mark hung up and immediately called Michael Carter. We've got a shot. Michael didn't hesitate. Where? Mark checked the incoming message. David's place. He says he has the proof. Michael swore under his breath. You trust him? No, Mark admitted, but I trust his survival instincts. He knows Richard won't save him. Michael was quiet for a moment. I'll meet you there. Mark grabbed his keys and headed out. By the time Mark arrived at David Carter's house, something felt off. The street was too quiet. No cars passed by. The usual hum of city life seemed muted. Michael pulled up a minute later, stepping out of his car cautiously. I don't like this. Mark approached the front door and knocked. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Mark and Michael exchanged a look before Michael reached for the doorknob. It turned easily. Inside, the house was dark. A faint metallic scent hung in the air. Mark spotted him first. David lay sprawled in the entryway, unconscious. Blood trickled from a wound on the side of his head. His phone, still clutched in his hand, vibrated once before the screen went black. Michael crouched beside him, checking his pulse. He's alive. Barely. Mark scanned the room. Papers were strewn across the floor. The desk drawers were pulled open, their contents dumped haphazardly. The safe in the corner stood wide open, completely empty. They took everything, Mark muttered. Michael stood, jaw clenched. Richard knew. Mark's hands tightened into fists. This had been a warning. A final message. Richard had anticipated their move, and he had struck first. David Carter lay unconscious in a hospital bed, his face pale against the harsh fluorescent lights. Machines beeped steadily beside him, monitoring his vitals. A security guard stood just outside the door, ensuring that no unauthorized visitors got in or out. Mark stood in the hallway, gripping the cold metal railing as he watched through the small window. David was supposed to be his key witness, the man who could expose Richard Thompson once and for all. Now, he was nothing more than another casualty. Michael Carter stood beside him, arms crossed. They didn't kill him, he said, voice low. That means they still need him for something. Mark exhaled. Or they just wanted to send a message. Either way, it didn't matter. David was out of the game, and the proof Mark had gambled everything on was gone. Michael checked his watch. We've got less than a day before the board votes Richard in as permanent CEO. If that happens, we lose any chance of getting this out in the open. Mark clenched his jaw. He had spent his entire career understanding power, how it moved, how it could be taken, how it could be stolen. Richard had mastered the last one. He didn't just remove threats, he erased them. And now, Mark was out of options. Then Michael's voice cut through his thoughts. We're missing something. Mark turned to him. What? Michael's eyes narrowed in thought. Sarah, remember what she said when we first spoke to her? She didn't just collect those payroll records. She backed up everything. Mark stiffened. The stolen USB drive had been their best bet. But what if it hadn't contained the only copy? She never told us where she stored the backup. Michael continued. Maybe because she was scared. Maybe because someone told her not to. Mark pushed away from the railing. We need to find her. Now. An hour later, they were standing outside Sarah Collins' small apartment. The building was old, the paint peeling from the front door. Mark knocked twice. No answer. Michael exchanged a look with him before trying again. This time, the door cracked open just enough for Sarah to peer out. Her eyes were tired, wary. I told you I'm done, she whispered. Mark kept his voice steady. David Carter is in the hospital. Someone got to him before he could hand over the evidence. Sarah flinched but didn't say anything. Michael added, they'll keep doing this, Sarah, to anyone who knows the truth. She hesitated, gripping the edge of the doorframe. Then, finally, she sighed. They came after me, too. Mark's stomach tightened. Who? Sarah swallowed. I don't know his name. But he showed up at my mother's house. Told her she should convince me to stay quiet. That if I didn't, things would get worse. Mark took a slow breath. Sarah, if you still have the backup, now is the time. Her eyes flickered with uncertainty. But she nodded. It's in a safe deposit box at an independent bank. I didn't want to keep it anywhere digital. If something happened to me, I needed it to survive. Michael pulled out his phone. How fast can we get there? Sarah grabbed her coat. Faster than they can. But when they arrived, it was already too late. The bank was quiet, its sterile white interior eerily empty. Sarah approached the front desk, handed over her identification, and waited. The attendant checked the system, frowned, and excused herself. A few minutes later, she returned with a supervisor. I'm sorry, Ms. Collins, he said, but the deposit box was accessed earlier today. The contents were removed. Sarah went rigid. That's impossible. The supervisor shook his head. According to our records, the authorized account holder withdrew everything this morning. Michael leaned in. Who? The man hesitated. We can't disclose that information. Mark clenched his fists. Richard. They had moved too slowly. Sarah took a step back, shaking her head in disbelief. It's gone. No, Mark muttered. His mind was already racing. Not everything. Michael frowned. What do you mean? Mark exhaled. If Richard found the deposit box, it means someone told him where to look. Michael's expression darkened. You think we have a mole? Mark nodded. We do. And whoever they are, they're holding the last piece of evidence we need. Mark sat at the far end of the long, polished conference table, his hands resting flat against the cool wood. The room was packed, board members, attorneys, high-ranking executives, all waiting for the final vote that would decide the company's future. The tension in the air was suffocating. At the head of the table, Richard Thompson adjusted his tie with practiced ease. His confidence was palpable, the smirk on his face barely concealed. Before we proceed, Richard began, his voice smooth. I'd like to address the accusations that have been circulating in the media. He glanced around the room, making eye contact with each board member as if he were reassuring old friends. These claims of financial misconduct and intimidation are nothing more than a desperate attempt to undermine this company's leadership. He continued, Mark Hamilton has exploited his former position to manipulate the narrative, tarnishing the very institution he once led. Mark forced himself to remain silent, even as he felt the weight of the room shifting toward Richard's side. The board members nodded slightly, murmuring in agreement. The trap had been perfectly set. Richard exhaled, feigning disappointment. It's unfortunate that we've had to endure this chaos. But now, we must move forward. I propose we solidify my role as CEO, so we can begin the process of restoring trust. The chairman cleared his throat. All in favor? Several hands began to rise. Then, the doors to the conference room burst open. All heads turned as David Carter stepped inside. His face was bruised, his arm still wrapped in a sling from the attack. But he walked with purpose, his gaze locking onto Richard's. A stunned silence fell over the room. I think you all should hear what I have to say before you make that decision, David said. His voice was hoarse but firm. Richard's expression barely flickered, but Mark caught the slight tightening of his jaw. The chairman frowned. Mr. Carter, this is a private. David held up a hand. Spare me the speech. I know how this works. I was part of it. His eyes swept over the board. And so was he. He pointed directly at Richard. A murmur ran through the room. Richard let out a dry chuckle. David, I understand you've been under a lot of stress. David cut him off. You tried to have me killed. Silence. David turned to the board, his voice steady. You all think Richard is here to clean up a mess. But what you don't realize is, he's the one who made it. He didn't just know about the wage theft and fraud, he orchestrated it. And when I became a liability, he sent his men to make sure I wouldn't talk. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Carter. David nodded, which is why I brought proof. Mark reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. With a single tap, the room filled with the sound of a recorded conversation. David's own voice crackled through the speakers. Richard doesn't care who goes down as long as it's not him. He set this up from the start, laundered the money, threatened employees, and when things got messy, He threw me under the bus. Then came Richard's voice, unmistakable. I told you to handle it. David, you're the one who got sloppy. If Hamilton keeps digging, you know what happens next. The recording ended. The room was dead silent. Richard's face turned ashen. That recording is doctored. Mark leaned forward. Then let's have forensic analysts verify it. The chairman straightened his glasses. I think we've heard enough. One by one, the board members lowered their hands. The chairman folded his hands together. Mr. Thompson, effective immediately, you are removed from any and all leadership positions. Furthermore, we will be conducting a full internal audit into these allegations. Security guards approached Richard, but he remained eerily still. Then, with slow precision, he turned to Mark. You think this is over? He murmured. You have no idea what you just started. Mark met his gaze. We'll see. Richard was escorted out of the room. As the doors shut behind him, the board members turned to Mark. The chairman cleared his throat. Mr. Hamilton, given your prior tenure, we would like to reinstate you as CEO effective immediately. Mark exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing against him. But instead of relief, something else settled in his chest. He had won this battle. But then his phone buzzed. A new text message from an unknown number. You may have won this round, but the real war is just beginning. Mark stared at the screen. Somewhere out there, beyond Richard, beyond everything he had uncovered, something bigger was waiting. Power reveals character. Some people use it to build, others to manipulate, but in the end, the truth always finds a way out. Mark Hamilton learned that exposing corruption comes at a cost, but doing nothing would have cost even more. So what would you have done in his place? Let us know in the comments. And if you love stories that uncover hidden truths, make sure to subscribe to Undercover Truths for more. The next revelation might be closer than you think.